산지 요거번 투비 칠도 태바친 비교 취념는 제발라 아니 저게 산지 송 탐제 아니 저게 냠는 제고래서 아니 저 나들이 태바친 비교 취 아니 상아도 티베 람냠는 제베네 파신티 비교 취념는 제고래서 지나다 차상 도스 제고래서지 어도시네 어디시에 아니 마세 안 저게 슝친버티게 안에 시체레스 안디 안지게 델로소 당한주기 주버지에게 담가지 델로소 주요레스 삼다바이나 네디고 마레스 지난디네 삼다바이나 디네 삼바이네 디네 아니 슝친벌이야 아니 지 통중던 걸 구워디고레스 아니 슝친벌이야 롭장 지엘이야 아니 지게 구버지에다 롭장에 되니 듬바디게 ane kiawala ane kertigores dineza ditigo maresaja andi mase shungchimbola tongju din chebena ane chobongile sagores status chene jiyo maresaja so deji shoge da duskor digor sherwa.
Good afternoon. This morning we finished looking at the first of the four greatnesses of the Dharma, the greatness of understanding all the teachings as not being mutually exclusive. And there we saw that in order to attain enlightenment, one needs to train in all of the teachings of the Buddha. And in terms of the Mahayana Dharma, one needs to train in both the tantric vehicle as well as the perfection vehicle. And then we also started to look at the second greatness, that of seeing all the Buddha's teachings as spiritual instructions. And here we are being warned against deprecating the great texts, seeing that these are something that one doesn't necessarily need to study. If one doesn't have the wish to be a propounder or a teacher of the Dharma, there's no need to study the great texts. One can just rely on personal instructions or spiritual instructions. This is a mistake. Rather, one should utilize all the great texts, rely on both the great texts as well as personal instructions. And if one cannot, not to deprecate the great texts.
아닌마 당은 못이 시시야래 대나서 당은데 되네 되네 김전 되네 이나서 되시 쇼게 셰바데 김전 되네 이나 되나 안데 타르도에 남라 밀루비 담바 초니 네 슝친보나 임메스 원장 라니 일로 셴발라 소비 윤sen기 담비 초도 슝데점라 때네 미니베 안 담비 맹아라 때네 데라라 녜바 절버자오 님도 맹아 철거바 인지스.
Looking again straight at the text on page 15, continuing where we finished off this morning. For those who want liberation, the infallible supreme instructions are indeed the great scriptures. It is nonetheless possible that due to poor intelligence and the like, you cannot reach certainty through relying on these scriptures alone as supreme advice. In such a case, you should seek certainty with respect to them, thinking, I will seek certainty with respect to them by relying on excellent oral instructions.
타르도에 남라 밀루와스 타르도에 남라 시들에 당은 저 타르바 토야 당 아니 산지요 고번 토비 치르도 람냠네 지게 타르바 되 바세도다 타바 코비 동알을 주비를 타르바 잠되 바다 디 멤비가 나가 저게 산지요 고번 토비 치르도 아니 데네게 토바 되바 남라 아니 밀루와스 노주 유니 메베게 담가 초도 유버데 가레스 슝친버디기리 해제래 밀루위게다 다 데네게 담가 산지요 고번 토비에게 타블람 띠엔비게 담가 초도 유버데 슝친버디기레스.
Look at the first sentence that has just been read out. For those who want liberation, the infallible supreme instructions are indeed the great scriptures. Here we should understand that liberation refers to, in particular, enlightenment, which would be attained via the spiritual development, which would lead to liberation from rebirth in cyclic existence, as one progresses to attain enlightenment. So we should understand liberation here as referring to the great liberation or that of enlightenment. And the infallible supreme instructions are indeed the great scriptures. In other words, what the presentation found in the great text, this is infallible, incontrovertible, or unmistaken.
이제 밀루비게 담바초 세대다 밀루와 세대 산지오 고방 투비치도 탑람 마노와 마투바 차상와 덴바디 흉침보디를 숨고르바 디숨고라 제자 담바초래 세대 되네 아니 이제 타바 투비치도 타바점 투비치도 있나야 타바 투비 람냠랭기 림바 당보디죠 니바디치오래 세베게 되네기 람냠리 림바 밀루와 세대 마노와 마투바디 되네 송야디 네 흉침만으로 송고래 제자 흉침보디 담바초래 세대 야쇼래 세대 송고라 담바초 세대
In the great text, one will find all the various stages of training that one needs to engage in, training one's mind in order to attain liberation. And these stages that are presented, stages of training that are presented in the great text, are complete and unmistaken, and therefore they are the best, they are supreme.
지사 nga ase dine sonye ge chik tele nga ase khwa che dam nga ase de 지사 da nga ji ge pene ji ge pechen ro sha na kyo ane sangye go ba to ba la ane janju sim gom go re ma janju sim gom go re da janju sim ma gom na ane sangye go ba to go ma re 지사 janju sim gom janju sim gi sim bi to ne jin ba de chu nyam le je go re se ji dine ge sonye ge 칙디 답송야디 디 담바로마 데 고구레 디니치 고구레 마 송야디 담바서 데네 송야기 나들라다 나들라 안자들라 나서 지나 담가 세지 온두신 송고로와 담가 세
Just before I come to what Genla presented, he's now just talking about the meaning of the word that I usually translate as spiritual instructions. And here in this first paragraph is translated in different ways. So we see in the heading, we have there just instructions. And then what we are coming to here, we have later oral instructions and personal instructions and probably a few other iterations. At the beginning we had in the second sentence, practical instructions. So these are different ways that the translator is translating the same word. So the word literally in Tibetan is the word in Tibetan. Now to come to Geshe's explanation, the word in Tibetan that's translated in these varying ways is damnak. So dam refers to instructions, and nak is a word for speech. So an illustration then of verbal instruction, or what did we have here? Oral instruction would be, for example, being told that in order to attain enlightenment, you need to engage in the 6 practices of generosity and so forth, conjoined with bodhicitta. So such an instruction to a practitioner made verbally would be what is referred to as an instruction, a personal instruction, an oral instruction, a practical instruction.
디네게 담가 세다 된 맹가 세 지바레 고 맹가 세다 담가 세 지바레.
There are 2 different words in Tibetan, damnak and menak, and there's no difference between them. So I can't say that any differently as a translator.
Are you saying ordinary dharma? Are you saying dharma like we normally understand dharma? What's the word?
The Tibetan word damnak. So dharma is the Sanskrit, the Tibetan is che. So this is the word for instruction in Tibetan is dam.
Dharma.
Yeah. If you were to write it in English, D-A-M.
Yeah.
And then nak in English would be as in ngawang, N-A-G. Yeah, N-A-G. Damnak. And the other one is menak, so in English would be M-E-N, and then the same nak.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. That's a different dham, and that's holy dharma or sacred dharma, or a particular venerable.
담비 최세다 담세다 담세다 담 said ma lava said ma sheba said. She's a shake nga de la nga so damas. She's a damia dam said nga in the pie. Ever chair meeting at Riva Garsore Penangazuki Lagbi Juba Lana Juba de Java of Cherry, June Lava, Lagbi Juba said Lava the Jew in the Kava made the Roger. Chico Java said Juba in the Java chair, Jugan de Lava Chagoro. Didn't Dam said it, Siktima, Lava de Java del Dam said, Tinga Corona. Java Jenga de la that not Dama Sigurdi. This is my that Dam said the Dam said the cargo was in Tarba Yana Tarba to be Chidu, Ma Chikil Tablam Sumba, Yana, and Sanji Goban to be Chidu, and the Ma Tablam Sumba de la Dam, so Ma Sheba de la Dam, the Nisha Citilla Na, sir. Tarbada Tamji came big Lam Gansele so dam Tartuna Sanji Gopon to be Chidu Tablam didn't be Tablam Dimbigi Dimbigi Siktela Damasawarda.
So the word again dam as in dam nak. So dam is instruction. So it's not just a general mode of conversing, but it's instruction. And then the nak is speech, so to be instructive speech, or one of the translations here was oral instructions or personal instructions. So the one word you see continuously throughout is that of instruction, because it is this way of communicating. It's direct and it's clear, or precise, maybe you could say. So it's not just like a casual conversation, but it's being instructed. So that's the same as in English. And then the second word, nak, this just implies speech. And then also went to say, so it would be, for example, these are the steps that you need to train your mind in order to achieve liberation or enlightenment. So in that context, this would be a spiritual instruction, a personal instruction, an oral instruction.
Sanji Sung Chazan Damgare, Mangare, Damgare. Zada Sanji Sung Kari Suena Taba Yan Tarba Tamjiki Mazoda, Tartuna, Sanji Govan to be Chudu, Sunsheva, Jaya Chagore, Jeza Denige Sumbugi, Pangazuki, Nyomomba Sea, Da, and the Chigi, Givi Yundin Java, the Sanji Govan to Tablam, Givi, Java, Jubege, Tablam, Sunsheva, Jaya, Chazan Damga Chagore. All
of the Buddha's teachings are spiritual instructions. So everything the Buddha taught was spiritual instruction. So when the Buddha taught, these are the various steps you need to cultivate or train your mind in order to attain liberation and enlightenment. These were spiritual instructions. They were teachings. When the Buddha taught how this is what afflicted minds are, and this is how to eradicate them, these were spiritual instructions, they were teachings. Likewise, these are virtuous minds, and this is how to accumulate them. This too is spiritual instructions or teachings.
Karsore, the George is Lamrim said, that then Jeremy Session Lamrim did Chazan Damare, Chazan Damare. Chazan Pejidike, the Chazan Damare. The blooded did they go to Equalki Marwa, you Marwa, go to Sugdima Marwa, Damga said. Tradulkonga, let Tralogodua. Chisa Jeremy Chima Sun shaping, Sun shaped, Lamrim Chimbalana, Jeremy Chima Chibering, Nadsha, Dima, Su Yidi, Nahadi, Yili, Susu Kosha Baramado, when you want a married. And so Chisonality Yigis Fish Dangroa. Then when a Yigis said, Kegi Dangdire. Jedan, Kenile Chibichi, Kedi Dangdil Yigisora. There are the Yigi Sukla, the Yungone Mare, and the Chizona Yigi speech Dangurwa in the Yungone di Mare.
So here we, just to say as a translator, we just need to have a broad mind to approach the usage of language. So now to come to what Genla said. So so the illustration I just gave for spiritual instructions would be everything that the Buddha taught. But so would fundamental wisdom composed by Nagarjuna, the text by Chandakirti, Lamp on the Path by Atisha, the middle and great Lamrim by Lama Tsongkhapa. All of these would be counted as spiritual instructions. So then I asked about, so these are written as opposed to spoken. And again, I went to say, so whilst we say in language that these are written, the word for writing comes from the word for speaking. So we should, or the word for letters. And letters, so the word for writing is the word for letters, and letters are spoken as well as written. So therefore, when it is said that a text such as this is included in spiritual instructions, it's not referring to the matter of the book or the written word, we would say, but we should understand it as rather the spoken word that this perhaps either comes from or is expressed through. So that's quite a lot of words, but what it comes down to is the great texts are also considered spiritual instructions.
Mm-hmm. Adinegi, Damga said, Chesa Damga de la Yan, Cuba Barma Cheba says, Cuba Barma, Chikasing Mount Sheswa, Damga, San Yujim in Mason, George Gasore, and Geshe Geshe Gaso Chiksung, Denmark, Jisma to do sing Gun Yobadilla, Damga Barma Chevase or Damga Barma Chevase. It's another Denigi Shandaz and Sosugi Mashuba Chepene, and the Lamrim Chimore, Sosugi, Shandaz and the Lamrim Pechuki Shumanoache, Tanzu Depchi Loche, Mashi Yobana, D. Dinity or said Ma Shebana, D. Damga di Barma Cheba di Yomare. Person Sosugi Lo Sheshamado, Damga Sosugi Nye, and di Damga Sosugi Mashi Yomare Chagoma, just that Damga Barma Chevas, Damga de la Damga Guba Barma Chebash, Yomada, and Dinigi, Chungur, the Anti Bar, Damga said the Anti Dinigi, member at in Urba, Sosurangi Damba shed. Is that the Druang, Shandala Mets and Pashi, Hanjoye, then Sosma, she, Jadi, Sosugan, some Danyam Jet, or Shana Shepadida, Damga Barma Chepasit, Duskin, Gunma Chepa, says Anzuga, Sunju, Lung Shu, as a Yechimbo did it, that is a Lung Shu, many Damba de Pa. Gun di Parma Cheva Shuya Chegore. Chesada, Skacheda, Dine Lungi Yomare study, Lungun Chesa Yomare said Yungdua, Chesadi Bara that Meva Chasore.
The teachings from the Buddha have been kept alive via the lineage of instruction that passed from the Buddha through his great disciples, later through Maitreya and Manjushri to Nagarjuna and Asanga, through to Atisha and all the great lamas in Tibet to the present day. So we looked at that a few weekends ago. So this is how the spiritual instructions of the Buddha, this lineage, has been kept alive and vibrant. And if someone were to teach a text, perhaps this one, which they hadn't received the transmission of, they would not have the lineage of spiritual instructions in relation to this text. But they would nevertheless be teaching it, but they would not possess the lineage of spiritual instructions in relation to this text. So to receive that lineage of instructions, one needs to have heard or received the oral transmission, and this is done via sound, from hearing someone read the text to one. So in this way, we can see that spiritual instructions are oral, and the spiritual instruction relating to a text is passed on orally.
Dunda Nimbola, Menga Senade, Damga Sene, Shung Chimbodi, Law Suji, Yomada, Shung Chimbodi, Damgare, and the Gasore, Mengare, Damgare.
In our context here, the meaning then is, of what we've been looking at, is there is no difference between spiritual instructions and the great text, or to use the other translations, there's no difference between the great text and oral instructions or personal instructions or practical instructions. They are one and the same.
The Nangole Chabardosu Shonsigre, Bene Menga Ladu, Lamigi Mengas, Bene Migilia, Loma Lami, Loma Gilia, Joran Dorje come the Chegures, and Jeta, Tamodu Susu, Sinjete, Susia, Asma, Lamigi, Ma, Loma Gilia, Dorje come the Chixungorwa, Di Mengare, in a Shunchimbo de Chodu Cuba, Dile, Shunchimbo Chodu Cuba, that the Dorje come the Chegores, Dorje come the Tablam Zamju Sumbare Mado, Lam Yamling Rimba Tomba Yokoma, Janshus Moga, Dinigi, Sungo Marwa, Chisan New Chago and Menga, New Chirwa. The Shunchimbanalia, and the Chige, Zawashir of Chile, Dinalia, Tomba Yikorpa, Chikba, some Mango, Gomiagi, Mondo Yendus in the Delia Lam, Solamna, Jolan, Tola, Dinigi Rimba Dingis in Gomea, the Dinamango, Chasawa Shigo was Sanji Yokoman to be a lamb, Chasawa Shigorwa. Tablam Chasawa, Sangma, Dingo was a lamb. Menga chore so that the Dorje Sembe Gomde Soedi, Dorje Sembe Rangkorong Gorang Gomde Sam Subare Mato Dile Mahan Sanjo Goma to which Tamla de Gomo Divo Chasungo Mara, she's a Dorje Sembe Gomde Dini Gomgore Dini Chegorta Sembege, Sumbigida, Sik Nunuchi, Malo Malama Sumbige Lami Soye Sikti, the Tamare. In a Chunchimana, Shunchimanajin, Yomare. Shung Dilla, Shung Chimbo to get Damo Chodu Yuba, said the Lam Chasawa Dingorwa. Gomde Chores, Candice Dene Gomgoris, Ma, Sumbi 60 Damareda.
So, whilst there's no difference between the great texts and spiritual instructions, there are spiritual instructions that are not the great texts. So, for example, if your spiritual teacher says to you, you need to engage in Vajrasattva practice, and this is how you should engage in it, and give you some advice, that's a spiritual instruction, but it's of course not a great text. The great texts have far more in them than merely how to have a brief presentation on a particular practice. The great texts will include, depending on the text, but often the 5 paths, the various perfections, and so forth. But so the great texts are spiritual instructions. But personal advice, personal spiritual instructions, these are, maybe I can leave out the word personal because again I didn't say it, but your teacher telling you, for example, that you should engage in a particular meditation and this is how to do so, that is a spiritual instruction, but it differs, of course, from a great text.
지산다 도시 심비고 검디 제고레 시비기도 검탕고 측유뉴지 담가디 가와니 리고르스는 슝침보 나는 리고레 지산 도시 심비고 그냥 검디 제디 유 나마 슝 나마 송샤여와 지산 디기 송샤 유 나로 송샤 차상 지롭죠 제나 지투면서 디니기 디나네 송샤 유 슝침보나 송샤기 추되제 윤수마 렌제 콜마 롭죠 지고 지산 담가 슝침보 나를 마송비게 담가지 요 말다 셰요 말에 지산 슝침보나 송샤기디 디니기 추 뉴뉴뉴지게 뒤뒤 추 렌지마 로마를 빠베게 로마를야 고 가세 롭죠 지 투구도 가세 지 투미도 뒤쇠다 아니 지금 미고 그런 감당 매바당 아니 콜리아 롭죠 지게 뒤쇠여다 매비게 제 투구도에 민도 온보 라브리 타솜 그런 거 뒤쇠다 차상을 팔라미게 지요도 안 디니실 콜레 내가 디니실에 약사를 선비게 선도 흉침비 나네 아니 지 냠렌지 림바직 투 뉴뉴된제 콜리아 안토나 디제쇼 송고로 지자 지자라미게 담가디 흉침비 나네 마안 소수기 냠렌지 디마 뉴뉴치 된시 송야레 마도 흉침보로 로소 담가세디 수제네 손매요 말이다 셰요 말이다 매바데 지자지 담가세디 흉침보로 로소 담가세 여바삼단에 맹아세디 로소 여바삼단 디디기 말에세디 노주레세디 제르미 손야 디레다가제 도시스미오 검디에 가와순 거래 슌나마 규나마 송고로와 제상가가 냠네 도지스메 곰네 제고라세 송어도 디난마 뉴뉴자 디난마 도지스메 곰데제 디난마 다이어 곰야기 림바지만 우어로 빼는 도지지나 다이 냠네 집에다 당보 지기 점로 셈게 되는 도지스메 곰데제 되는 많은 지게 초신사 답되는 마지 지 라이어 곰야지 뭐죠 제상 디데선나네 충충시 되는지 콜리아 디켜론 검쇼 송고래 진짜 흉친보나 송제위 담가 직对수를对마这个人，其实今天在的他们这用情不拿了要嘞，其实用情不拿了没得看见他们的这样没法的，其实今天在用情不拿用情不这个啰嗦的，其实每个在的边嘛是开发的跑吧的，什么上单的可以卡卡的吧，上单的这个嘛的是那边每个这其实用情不拿了嘛，越把这是嘛对就送过的也是的。
But to continue with the illustration, where a teacher gives spiritual instructions, well, for example, you should engage in this practice and this is how to do it. So these will be spiritual instructions, but the teacher is not teaching a great text to you. So there is a difference. That being said, that spiritual instruction that you are receiving is drawn from the great texts. So through the teacher's expansive education, they will be drawing out something that they see as, in this context, particularly appropriate for their students. So therefore, whilst this is not a great text that you have been presented to you, but solely a spiritual instruction, that spiritual instruction is not something apart or other than the great text. Not, in other words, it's not something that wouldn't be found in a more expansive way in the great texts. So, for example, if you're getting guidance on a sadhana practice, then the teacher may be helping you just with a particular point. But that particular point in your sadhana practice that you are getting guidance on or receiving spiritual instructions from, these would have been drawn from great texts. So therefore, the spiritual instructions you are receiving are in complete accordance with the great texts. So therefore, when one hears of or receives spiritual instructions, one shouldn't, maybe here we could really say personal instructions, one shouldn't relate to them as being of particularly great or supreme importance, but because this would then lead one to looking down on the great texts and seeing this as something separate, as perhaps the vital summary, rather than recognizing that this is just a presentation drawn from the vast body of knowledge, and in this context, this brief condensed advice is what is being given.
And in that, Shun Chimbo City, Chimbo Lavi, go Penang Jala and Chimbo the bed, by Geshe Thubten Rabten, that Shun Chimbo of the Shun Chimbo of the Tarba, Bendigo, Lam Rimba, Gyachimbo, Mamu about that, then is a Chimbo lager. Chunchu Lamne, Chunchu Lamne, there's mother, New mother, Benet Anzugi, Dorje Sembe Comde Chibu, she Song Shepi, Shun Chunchu, the Shun Chunchu Chunchu Sigura. Dina Shin Dangazugi, the Gewachima Hada Mukovan, some Tobiga Tablam, Chibu Denshi, Shun Shun, the Shun Chunchu, Shun Chunchu Chagua. Says that Dangazugi, Gewachima Hada Mukovan to be Tablam, Tarba to be Tablam, and the Chig Della and San Yokovan to be Tablam, Dus Denshaban. Temple Shung did that Shung Chimbo, the Garson Dina de Geshe Masona, Tarba, Tamjiki Mokova to be Tablam, Yachimbo Joba, and Shung Chimbo, Geshe Yachimbo. The Shung Chunjula, the Dina de Geshe, Jigni Kashi Mado, Digor Mado, Sung Mebaza, Shung Chunchu said, Shung Chimbo da, Chunchu said, Shung Chunga, the Shung Chimbo said, Garson di Geshe, Yachishung on the Sigore. Shung Rachagiru, 이거 죄제를 지단 책용유 고 책용화와 집변의 람림 중요하다데 그 책용유 책으로 책용유 된다를 차상에는 이 된다 차상 창조여 발마도 망보지며 말와.
And then to differentiate between great texts and small texts would be a great text presents all of the stages of training that one needs to engage in order to spiritually develop to the point of perfection. So all the trainings required in order to attain a good rebirth, all the trainings required on that basis to attain liberation from samsara, and all the trainings required in order to become enlightened. So this would, and maybe instead of all, but certainly the vast majority, or perhaps all, would be included in there. This would be a great text. A small text will be something that is either covering just one, two, or three, just a few of the topics, whereas the great text will cover just about all of them. Or the small text would maybe make reference to many topics, but only describe them very briefly, just in a verse or so.
Lamrim Chimboda, Lamrim Jinda, Lamrim Chimu Sadi. Lamrim Chimbo Nande Chugu Tigma, Tigma Karachavare, Di Geshe de Manga Ding Higorwa, Chesa Geshe Manga Tigma Korwa, Chesa Geshe de Geshe Chasa, Ningbo Chasan Duba Imbala, and Geshe does Nuaji Sheva, then the Tignua Chagorwa. And then the Lamrim Chumula, Lamrim Dudin said, Tignuj Madoyomare, Donda Chasan. Dina do Yorodina, Donda Digi, Pa Yeva in Higo Marwa. Zida Bene Janjusim Gom Gori, Samado, that Janjusim Gom Gori City, this Janjusim Gomia Sungordina, Janjusim Goma, Molaniela, Canas Gombo, Nije Gom Hassan, Namda, Nije, Magiam, Jinsu, the Gombo, said this gave a Higo Marwa. Zida Lamrin Chimonala, Janjusim Goma Dambo, and Nije, and the Kosura. Jundia Mania Dunyukone, and the Jinjo Dambo, and the Chick, Danyong Gomgorda, Di Shelia, Mashakum, then a Jinso, and then Niela Jamba, Yon Jamba, Nishembo, Hassanam, didn't Janjusum Gomgor said, then a Rimba Mambuji Shigorova, Sungorova. This one at 6 dear Mango Chagore, Shady, Sunya Diama, Juja, Yavuro Chagorova. Lamrim Dudunala, Dunda Chasan Janjusum Gomgori, Chasan Sungordina. Di Gomeg Rimba de Gavajin Sungo Marenza, you could Gava Juja, Gava Masonwaza, Juja Gibume, Tia Dudu in the Chumos Dudu Chumsa. That Lamrim Jindinala, Ma Juja de Dus Gans, Lamrim Chimbanajan, Dus Juja de Dus Nuache, Chumos in the Dus Sharamache. Sena, the Negi Juja de Sonda de Dus, this song, and Tidia Dus Manu Bazat. Lamrim Jing says this was. Just like the Shung said, Shung Chembo, Shung Labdu, Juja Temper in a D. Juja de Giavarochi Mavache, and the Nuchi Dordu Dunda Sound by Imbala, Nuchi, seeing Nuchi, Sonji, Shung Tigela, Shung Tigenda, Shung Chung said, Chung said, the Neche, Shung Chembo Labdu, Dunda Chazan Sama, Digi. Juja then just Giavarochi to Shin, Siamon, and the Nekum Koyachitua.
So if we compare the three Lamrim texts that Geshe Rinpoche composed, we see that on one hand you've got the Great Lamrim, then you have the Middling Lamrim, and the Song of Spiritual Experience, or the Small Lamrim. So the first two, the great and the middling, we would, in this context, we would refer to as great texts because they cover a vast number of topics or subjects and present them in detail. So a lot of words are written. Whereas the Song of Spiritual Experience, the short Lamrim, that whilst it's touching on all the topics of training one needs to engage in, they are presented very briefly, merely being instructed to cultivate a particular topic. But the details of how to cultivate that topic just are not presented in the small Lamrim. Hence, that would not be called a great text, despite having so many topics, but the detail is lacking. Whereas if you read either the great or the middling Lamrim, as we are here, all the topics are there, as well as tremendous detail on how to cultivate them. And all the points, for example, to gain a good rebirth, all the various trainings that one needs to engage in are presented, as well as how to, on that basis, attain liberation. So those chapters are all there. And when it comes to, for example, cultivating bodhicitta, these are also presented in detail with all the steps laid out. So this is the case in the great text, but the small text, or the short texts, then these may be referenced, but the detail is lacking, or a number of topics may be completely absent. So a short text then may have a lot of topics, but lack detail, or may only have a few topics, but have detail. So that would comprise, those two would comprise short texts.
제자다 되니게 담가 세시에 아주 담가도 파 지금 아주 심주에 예와래 제나 망보아래 태신라된 비 담가세야지 태바침비기 강사들이 봐 숨비 담가 태신라된 비 담가서 제가 년도 이리진이야 탈바토에 마순지비 되들라 년도라된 비 담가 랑일라된 비 담가세야다 두신 담가 안дел래야 안지게 가서 야지 녀마 송선에 양자 송야 용구로와 근데 람림 심보시 바 나머지 양자티야 용구로와 제가 되니게 담가들이야 지금 예와를 쳐봐나 되니게 안에 태신이야 담가 태명이 담가서 태명이 담가래 년들라된 배 담가 란절라된 배 담가서 디용구로와 진앙로 봐 예와 체이 먹고 용구래 근데 태신라된 배 담가들이야 안에 상아도지 태비게 제도 집에 유버디게를 땜배 담가 안에 80배 냠내 책에 대술을 땜배 담가 세 담가 세상에 담가서 흉되니까 가가 시구로데 예와체도 치도지비 두시 용원에 되게 예와체야 먹용으로 와.
Putting aside the difference between small and great texts and going back to looking at spiritual instructions, there are also a great variety of what composes spiritual instructions. There may be those that are specific to practitioners of a hero lineage, those that are specific to practitioners of a solitary realizer lineage, and those specific to practitioners of the Mahayana Dharma. And then there may be those which present the full range of trainings that someone needs to embark in order to attain enlightenment, such as the text we are presenting here. So there's a broad array of texts that would be called that are spiritual instructions.
최지부이네 아직 가서 솔이야 미 델라 템피게 라마 델라 템피게 가 델라 템피 담가라 델라 템피 담가라 세대가 시슈시 연구로와 라메기 교란디 냠내지 디네디 제샤서 교란디 디네디 제샤서 제자데 아니 가사 델라 템피 담가서 델라 콜 템피 담가서 데네기 담가가 요마 연구로와 되네.
And furthermore, one teacher may give different spiritual instructions on the Mahayana to different students. So to one student, they'll say, you need to engage in, concentrate on training in this particular topic. And to a different student, they would tell them to concentrate on a different topic. But both would be spiritual instructions of the Mahayana Dharma.
당간제래 나중에 산지에 고방 투유 취도 탑lâm 가래 템바이네 디 당보 산지 송마르와 지나 산지 송바치고 송마르마도 산지 마송비 최지 아주 최 사바셰지 요마래 지나 산지 송시비 최장야래 산지 송시비 담가 송셰교디 안주게 되는 마진 규신 지진 잠바 공반 마 규에 공부를 마 규신 안주게 되네게 되는 마니 된 안주게 디나는 마 아니까 가사 감남에 발레드네 시기 순거 담가 찍어봐 롭신 되지고 이제 담가 세야지 흉치벌 로소 안 담가 세야지 돼요 말에 지상 렘미게 담가 세야지 저선 흉치벌 나를 유예돼 말에 지상 흉치벌 로소 담가 세요 말 지상 담가 세야지 흉치벌 나를 연구 그래 지상 흉치벌의 시취에 냠내제기 맹아요 말에 세야다 주 지상 맹아 세야지 흉치벌 로소 네 흉치벌 나 매비게 로소 냠내제기 디제 그래서 담가시 맹아도 요래 삼바다면 딘도주리에서 지금 대시교회는 시에도 자산이 된다지래
Moreover, whatever spiritual instructions one encounters was originally taught by the Buddha. There are no spiritual instructions that have not been originally taught by the Buddha. And from the Buddha, the lineage of these spiritual instructions continued through Manjushri and Maitreya, through the great masters of ancient India, into Tibet, and to the present day. So therefore, whatever spiritual instructions a student may receive directly from their teacher will not be something that is not to be found in the great texts. There are no spiritual instructions that do not originate from the great texts, because the great texts and all the great texts, of course, originate through the lineage from the Buddha. So therefore, all spiritual instructions that one may encounter, these are to be found in the great texts, and one should not see them as separate or distinct. And that then is the meaning of what we've been looking at here.
lo shenpa la so pa la du Gabriele dusu meba ko nyamyo chige lo da riba nyuba yuen na yang dusu ki madang wa la ko yu yin da de ne ge dusu ki madang wa yang ka she le ya chige jihu ji je de jihu she sha na de ne simju cha ro de ne je ka le jab ji tu sa ma le simju cha ne de ne je ma tu ye yong se lo pa de ko rong le ya lo pa pe ge de ne ge yin za gyumsen de la de ne ani gansa kamna meba denile dene damba chodo shung dezamla dene nge minu bazide and denigi shung dambe cho shung chimbo dela denje dezamla ya nyamle chege gohab ragyo ma gohab meba da dezamla de lobchon chi tu minu bainza ane khola ane garsone dambe menga la dene dedala ngeba zelgo zelwa jawo nyamdu menga chogo ba yin sisa dene za ngay dene shung chenpo chige tayala nga juzi mendo kohab lage mendo dene ge shung chenpo dinge ta tusa mara sempe samla na dene ge yan tsik yung chigiliya dona yung dene chida yung chigiliya pa lame ge lame zin damga shu che an dene ge dene ane nyamlin chigin sempe ge odu shina samda de mengwa chogo bari se.
Continuing in our text. It is nonetheless possible that due to poor intelligence and the like, you cannot reach certainty through relying on these scriptures, such as supreme. You cannot reach certainty through relying on these scriptures alone as supreme advice. So this then refers to several situations. Perhaps one does have the opportunity to study the great texts, but the meaning isn't settling for oneself. And one's maybe mental capacity is a bit overwhelmed by the great text. So if one finds oneself in such a situation, or if one is of sharp faculty, if one is intelligent, but one lacks the free time to engage in the intensive studies that are required to get to know the great texts, or thirdly, if merely encountering one of the great texts, apprehension arises in oneself, seeing the size and the complexity. So if any of these situations, for example, if one finds oneself in any of these situations, then, and we continue here, in such a case, you should seek certainty with respect to them thinking, I will seek certainty with respect to the great texts by relying on excellent oral instructions. So this then is advice for those who, for whatever reason, the great texts are either impenetrable for them or not accessible for them. Then they should, with a respectful attitude, without an attitude of deprecation, seek out personal instructions.
shung chimbo chitang tawa, di sung ya ta tu sa ma re, da di jik yung sa ma zin xia xia bai na, na nga zu gewa zhu yue ke chue jie guhab di nira yuwa ma rwa, nga du zu me di shung chimbo di daya di yu guhab mi du, da du zu me du ta tu sa ma re se, ni ta tu sa ma re se ne, di na nga kanya ching me se be ke chue ma jie bai na, nga zu lu gyong ra gyo rwa, di na za, di ni ki guhab me bai na, 데니기 메바나다 데니기 레미 맹아 직 뉴지 레미게 도르지 레미즈는 슈이시네 하는 가서 디토네 냠네 제게 강토도 샤고리에서 그러다 제가 베네가 저게 jamrosia de jamrosia ke ta chasan jamrosia de la mi ma jik tam nga shu dine jamrosam da da dine ge an jige shung chim bo te da dine jamrosam da ne nyu ro cha ge ro wa an dina shin da de tu sira ya jik da ha she tu sira da dine ge ne tu doji sembe kom de nga jo ge chu ji ji kam ha she na la de so chi tu ye cha ge ro wa jesa shung kya chim bo da dine ko ma ra ba na ne la mi tam nga doji sembe kom de che ya ge tam nga shu che dine doji sembe kom de che ya ondu sene nga jo ge nyam ne che ko re jesa dine ge kya chim bo da ma ra ne du nyam ne che ba tam nga shu che ane nyam ne che ba ne so so ge jo de phe du wo de di ba yong du wo de jesa nyam ne chi le wo jesa dine za du shen nyam ne de ya de so so ge ri ba de ya de dine shung chen bo le ya an ji pe ka le ja mo ja chi lamsa de sta wa chen lamsa go tu ya da ni ba li go re jesa du shen ya ne nghe ba zal go re se de dine gi dona di ha go ya le ya tablam dine je go re so ra jesa da ga ju ge 뉴뉴뉴제 안도체의 장기 제지도 소수게다 개와 개주사 되네 로직바디 야야조도 되네 곧 돈다디게 차상 길길이 하고도 투그레스 제가 되네자 두치는 냠는 제고르마도 아다 흉자 침보를 따등에다 투사 말에서는 파샤샤나 요하요 말 경험하고 그래서 돈다디 숨어래.
Furthermore, where this is important advice, either for us to bear in mind or to share with others, is that if one sees the great texts or hears about them and thinks, well, that's beyond me, I don't have the time commitment or I don't have the confidence in my intelligence, therefore, what to do? There's nothing for me to do, and one turns one's back on the possibility of the Dharma, that would be a grave loss. That would be a grave loss. Rather than such a person or person finding themselves in such a situation should seek out spiritual instructions. So, for example, if one were to go to a teacher and say, I do not have the opportunity or the capacity to engage in extensive studies, please give me some advice. And the teacher then may well give a teaching on, say, refuge. And then you reflect on that. Or perhaps one attends teachings just on one topic, such as refuge. So this wouldn't be counted amongst the great texts, but it would be spiritual instruction. One may come to know one topic of the Dharma quite well. And then one would, whilst receiving the teachings and thereafter, reflect repeatedly on those teachings on that one topic. And in this way, some transformation to the mind would come in relation to that one topic. Certainly a lot of virtue would be accumulated and thereby non-virtue purified. And another illustration would be if approaching one's teacher may give different advice and say, engage in a practice, say, of Vajrasattva, and then maybe give an explanation on Vajrasattva, and then one goes away and practices in accordance with one's spiritual instructions, practicing Vajrasattva, and in this way accumulating virtue, purifying non-virtue. And this then shows that if one cannot, for whatever reason, engage in the great texts, there is the opportunity to rely solely on spiritual instructions in this way, or personal instructions, and through this accumulation of virtue and purification of non-virtue, then perhaps later in this life, or certainly in future lives, the opportunity to engage in the great text may well come. And this is then a skillful way to proceed, rather than just saying, well, I cannot study the great texts, therefore I'm going to do nothing.
dine za dine yin da shung nam ni sa chi ye jue ba zam yin bie ning bo me la me nga nam ni nan gi duen den be cho go yan de mi song os.
The final sentence. But you should never think that the great scriptures do not contain the heart of the matter, thinking they only outline external knowledge, while the personal instructions are supreme because they present the inner meaning.
지난 슝 남니 지혜 주바 자민지 닝보 메세 대시 슝 첨보 되게 세우로 슝 되게 치게 주바 세듬 당한 저기 마시에 직체 마 젠리야 셰리야 자야 직제 치게 줘발도 샨다기 균주에 제발은 지금은 균주에는 디마 리포트 디디레 디거든 교회 말씀 파 직제 치게 줘봐 치료게 생기 은지 균주에 제발은 어디 균마 디마레 디디르세 파시는 파 균의 가야 좀 줘봐서 파 치야 미션다기 결혼해서 람 고미야지 지금도 균주에 제중으로 와 제가 균제 제바 될 준제는 어디 람딘디딘데 두수를 지고서 파 시에셔로 와 태바침이 취요 말에 태바주제 판도요 말에서 나가 연구로 와 제가 태바침이 취해지는 판도 요래 예비기 태바침이 취해서 내가는 된지 라고래 제가 냠는 제가 된데서 마시에도 아니 분이 도과데 마세주고로 와 진짜 치게 줘봤은 지소 치로기 결혼디 지기면도스는 균주 제다 되니게 지고로자 로바를 지 연구해봐 도과 연구해나 디셀마 되는데 디스투스레스 파 지기 셀이야 치고 제제 봐서 제가 판도고래서 치 제주봐
치하고의 치셰파 데 사체 콜라레 이라고 보고서 데디 치인지인는 어쩌겠어요.
이간질에 마시에게 직체 미수게 되네 지금 노루 되네 두어서 도바사야다 되네기 소소죄바 용바이나 난지리 지바레 되네 레서 김세 마시 시야도 디 파이 죄바다디 도바데 세네 까고르와 치 제죄바스 죄바스는 매바서야서 파 타파다 tum는 죄셔는 매하서야서 그 마루로 안디나지 제변이 현재 산지비 최세 간듯이 안디지 타바토야 말에 아니 타바세도 요 말에 선셰베이나 타바세 요래 타바세데 디니지 레고래 타바 디니지 타바 두탄 디네 두고래에서는 마셰디 아니 그런기 타바 요 말에 세야다 아니 타바 토야 요 말에 도바디파 세두고로 와 진짜 도바디 마지고로 와 도바 매바스고로 와 치게 줘봐서 치게 줘봐서 디니지 레고래 어서야 되지
Just reading the sentence again then. Yeah. But you should never think that the great scriptures do not contain the heart of the matter, thinking that they only outline external knowledge, while the personal instructions are supreme because they present the inner meaning. So these few words, there are a few words here in the translation that seem to be mistaken. Thinking they only outline external knowledge. So this outline external knowledge isn't the meaning here, but it's rather that thinking that where someone thinks that the purpose of studying the great text solely serves the purpose as in enabling one to cut or eliminate or refute what people externally are saying to one. So the word we have here as outline should rather be translated as to refute, and external knowledge would refer to things that are being said by those outside or external to one, and thereby one can refute that. So, for example, if someone were to say the Mahayana teachings are not the teachings of the Buddha, this would perhaps give rise to a doubt. So here one would be able to refute a wrong statement like that. Or if someone were to say the Buddhist presentation on liberation is nonsense, liberation is not possible or not achieved in the way that the Buddha taught, then this would be would be an external presentation, and one would refute it. So that's that it would be the correct understanding of what we have written here as the outline external knowledge. So that would be a mistranslation.
Would you say outside?
Yeah. So what we have then as external knowledge would be what someone is saying to you. Yeah, so as opposed to a thought arising, someone saying to you, and then outline should be to rather be to refute.
나도 나라 치고 예줘 봐서 치 예줘 봐서 디시고래 제 생기 되게 탈바 토야요 마 탈바 요마래 세야 되게 도바다 되게 용거반은 파 예비기 김세 줍시 파도 신의 송요도 안디 파 도바티 파 매바 수익을 도바 지그리에서 도바 매바 수익을 해야지 제가 쉬운 침보되게 되게 치고 예줘 봐서 마도 냠는 제라 아니 담가도 요말 세베 삼단에 지고 말해야지 제가 도시네 디시고를 치고 예줘 되네 지고 말해서 제가 맹하게 남 맹하셔야지 아니 난게 된된배 초고 냠도 미송고 제가 맹하셔야지 쉬운 침보들의 로소다 냠내 림바된 비기 지기 된된 거래디 초두기 바래 쉬운 침보들의 디 야쇼래 선비 삼단이네 지고 말당교 말해서 미송고
So maybe just try just retranslate these few words. But you should never think that the great scriptures do not contain the heart of the matter, thinking that they only serve to refute others' wrong views. Yeah, maybe like that, refute others' wrong views, while the personal instructions are supreme because they present the inner meaning. So that's perhaps a more accurate way to translate it. So what we've been warned against here is to think the only purpose of studying the great text is so that one can refute the wrong presentations or the wrong views of others, such as, there is no liberation, for example, and thereby be able to refute with reasons their misunderstanding or perhaps any doubt that may arise in one's own mind. So one shouldn't think that that is the sole purpose of the great text, because if one sees the sole purpose of the great text as that, one will think that spiritual instructions or personal instructions are something different, in that one will see the great text as not containing the teachings for training one's own mind. The great text will be seen as not presenting what one should be putting into practice, training one's mind in, but that what one is supposed to put in practice or train one's mind in is found separately somewhere other than the great text, such as personal instructions or oral instructions or spiritual instructions from one's Lama. That would be a wrong conclusion or a misunderstanding that here we are being guarded against.
제가 되네자 맹아세디 대시 맹아세디 라메기 응아줄야 디냠는 되는 시호르에서 마 손에게 맹아들이 슝침베 나는마 지그 된제 송거를 마도 슝침볼에 로수 슝침보나라 메디게 맹아지 손에 매바래 제가 되네자 슝침보디 아니 마시슈 잠레 치 아니 고여줘봐 잠레 마도 냠는 제게 띵거 된다디 닝보디 띵거 말해서 맹아세디 냠는 제게 된다 닝보 띵거디 약쇼 슝침보디 약쇼에 삼다베네 디노트디 삼다교 말해 제가 맹아세디 마는 가와의 용어는 슝침보나라 용어래서 제가 슝침보나라 유에대 차상 유에대 말해서 제가 내내 유에대 이내 소소라는 게 슝침보가 냠는 제게 로션지에 고합 매바다 아니 지금 소소기 인용도기 마당바다 근데니기 이인바는 그냥 담가 뉴뉴를 때네 근데 지금 로션 아주게 계절 듣고 고래서
What's presented here then is that we should guard our mind from making the mistake, thinking that the great texts and the spiritual instructions are something separate, thinking that what one is supposed to put into practice, how one trains one's mind, is to be found solely in spiritual instructions, and that the great texts form or serve a different purpose. This is a mistake. spiritual instructions arise from what is found in the great texts. So ideally, one should refer to the great texts for one's spiritual instructions, because they are the source of personal advice or oral instructions. But for those who either lack the opportunity to engage with the great texts, or they lack the strength of mind that is required, well, for them then they should seek out spiritual instructions, and that's what they should rely upon.
Rubin Yamlin Chigu, Wonder Sagu, that Jing and Wonder Sache, that Jig Yamlin Shuchi, that Shung Chimpolia, Chi Tuasam Lubnoche, the Duzupe, Shuke, Jing Yamlin Chigu, Marasambe, some Tati to go Mareshe. Sazanga Wonder said the Karesne, Muishi, Tingis in Gomiada, and Gombaki, Yamlin Cheg, Rimbadi, Yahu Yoneg, Dondala, Nielia, Dediche, some of the Sonam Sayada. Dedicati, and the Wonder said Sawacha, Jasne, Sosolia, Deba Dana, Cherakia, the Sunam Sai, Muishi, Yamle Yaku, Yonalaya, and Yelia to Kiju, Sunam Sawa, and that the Wonder said, the Wonder said, Muishi, Tuyegi, Nielaya, and Dejili, Masona, the Twinkin to Kueti, Jedelia, Wonder, Sigua, the Wonder said. Muishi, Wonder, Muishi Tuyegi. Muishi Yamlin Gom Yamlin Jegi, which the Yaku Yala, the Nielia, the Sunam Sada, Gejurgi, Sunam Yamasabana, Muishi the Yakuyon 2 Mevaza, the Yakuyon Dundala, and Nielia, Wonder to get Saya go up the Sahura, decided Geshe Kavasaya, Dini, Muishi the Yakuyon Dundala, and Wonder the Sagurua.
A further iteration of this mistaken understanding would be someone who thinks, I should be engaging in my preliminaries. This is actual practice. There's no need to spend the immense amount of time required studying the great text. Rather, I should engage in my preliminaries. So here, someone's engaging the preliminaries, pushing aside, deprecating, seeing as unnecessary the need to engage in studying the great texts. So this is a mistake, because it's a mistake coming from understanding both the purpose of the great text as well as that of the preliminaries. The purpose of the preliminaries is before one engages in actual practice or the main practice, one would need to cultivate a lot of merit, so that when one engages in the main part of one's practice, then that goes well.
Dorjiji Yamlen Chewan, the Wonder, I think is Dorjiji Yamlen to do many killing, Jena, Timbi, Gomeg, Yamlen Chedra, Dinelia, Wonder to get Sawa, Chesan Dinamlen, the Yakoyag, Dondala, Yel, Wonder to get Sonam Sawa, Chesan, San Dubai, Dorjiji, Nada, and Deshona Karine, winning Wishi, Yamlen Chealia, Yakoyag, Dondala, Yele. Gawa Sunam Sagu, it is a Wonder Sagu, just a Yiki Saya, and the Chicha, Sasa, the Wonder Sunam Sagu. Did you saw Sana, didn't wish it, my Yamle, the Yamle Yakuyon Tuyagi, to call Yungorwa, and it's a wishing Yamle Yakuyala, Wonder Sagu, what is it?
So to give an illustration to make that a little clearer, if one wants to engage in the generation stage practice, for example, of a particular deity, such as Yamantaka or Gyasamaja, before that generation stage practice, which would be one's the main practice, or one's objective, perhaps would be better to say, for that to go well, one needs to first accumulate a lot of merit. So therefore, one first engages in the various preliminaries to accumulate vast stores of merit, so that when one engages in For example, the cultivation or the generation stage of a particular deity, that which will be one's main focus would go very well. So therefore the preliminaries are done before the main practice. So the preliminaries are done before, in this case, engaging in retreat on a generation stage practice of a particular deity.
ngui sang du bi ge nyam len che de la ne ya ko yang ye don da chi go re wa che sa di ngon ro da chi ba re che sa da shung chen bo le ya thwe som gom sa da de ni ge shira go ga ma ra gen chi ma da wen de de ni ge tho le ne ngon ro yi chi che sa ya de ti chi ti su chi ngon ro de ngui shi de ya ko yang don da re che sa ga re ne ngui shi ya ko yang ya don da cha go ro wa che sa di sang du bi shung le ya thwe ba che di don da le ba sam 또 현대의 냠는 제다 진바 어디 상황도비 냠는 제 당보 디세 디제 차상 제고도 아주 유예하고 차안에 소선 냠는 제나 무시 냠는데 야고 용구로 와. 시선 상황도비 곰 냠는 마진이라 상황도비 흉날 바 롭종 제네 가네스 곰고걸 당보 가네스 제고를 니바 가네스 제고를 삼다나 가네스 당고를 로브자 망보의 제네 퇴바 제 되네 도나 망보 삼다나 두셰베네 제마 상어디비 곰님네 제발라 디네 삼날 바 방로 마선 디디오 바자 수수이 삼다나들다 제직바 삼다나 그 돈다디 차상 레로시 때 샤투로 와 제자 디네서 롤바 샤제 샤야다 둠데 용고라 제자디 무신냠네 제알야 아니 shung chen bi sang du bi gi shung chen bo la thue sam je de ye chen bo ji di nang mo shin yam na che ya pan do ya chen bo ngor ba che de ro wa na di go ra ma du na di go wa da go du wa yong go ma du wa ko na du se da ko na du bo sam ne du ya yong go wa ma na de ni gi chi ge me ne ko ta ga rang kom yam na che na do na di ro wa
Someone who has studied the great texts well, then when they come to embarking on a particular tantric practice, a Guru Samaja, based on their extensive studies, they will know how to. They will understand exactly how to engage in the practice on Guru Samaja. So one could reflect, could call their extensive hearing, reflecting, and meditating on the great texts as their preliminary to engage in deity retreats, such as on Guru Samaja. That being said, someone who has engaged in extensive hearing, reflecting, and meditating on the great texts, despite also knowing then all that needs to be known to engage in their main practice, that of, say, Guru Samaja, they may choose to engage in the preliminary practices as well, and that would be their choice. So this then is the case of someone who is learned and has studied the great text well. They will understand how to practice, or it will already be known to them the deeper meaning of how to practice.
Dine za dine gi shung chen bo le thwe sam je di won zhong ne cha ge ro won zhong wa de ka san ngui shi ya bo yang lo won zhong re nyang an zu ge ji da san won zhong sa ho re se di won zhong di ya ji ma bom da bom yi yi cha bom se won zhong dang go re se di ji so gi ding an zu di won zhong se di cha ge ma de duen ngo ma la won zhong di so won zhong re ka san ne thwe sam ye 직 제기 곰제야 당보 아니 녀래 무시디 맞이 녀래 퇴섬 제도 원로 책으로 와.
In fact, the real preliminary to engaging in a retreat such as that is to study the great text. That is the actual preliminary. But these days we tend to use the word really for those other preliminary practices that people these days tend to do more regularly. But the best preliminary, the original preliminary, the actual preliminary is an extensive education, studying and reflection based on the great texts.
donda kare kala sae donda digo dono chedu digo ro ngonjo ro wa deso ani andi na jire 퇴바 다 퇴비기 냠네 제 삼비 냠네 제데 퇴삼 이 제가 되가서 고미하게 된다라야 니녀를 고미야 될 당보 퇴 된다게 삼 되네 고무고로 와 지상 고미하게 뭐시래도 맨 고미해야 되시고로 와 지상 고미해라 되네 당보 퇴 된다 삼바도 고고로 퇴바다 삼바지 지 고고에서데 고미기 원조 소고데 퇴삼이 최고로 와
Before you ate lunch, then you would have engaged in the preliminary of laying out the table. When the preliminary is done, one is ready to engage in the main activity of eating a delicious lunch. So similarly, before one engages in the main activity of meditation, one engages in the preliminaries of hearing and reflecting. So therefore, in the three, hearing, reflecting, and meditating, hearing and reflection should be understood as the preliminary practices of someone who's going to engage in meditation. And just to say again, as an aside, with these three, hearing, reflecting, and meditation, meditation specifically refers to the cultivation of the union of calm, abiding, and meditative insight on that particular topic.
저기다 참 되긴스네 제 원조로시게 지게 장사에 와다 직 장사된 것이 갑을 참지도 곧에 지게 도시네 장사에마도 대응엄하게 땅은 겁나다 지미 봤어야죠 고미야디 그 됐어 녀래 롭종 제면은 됐을까 하고라 자기로 와대
If we imagine two people engaged in retreat, but they're doing the same retreat, but they had very different preliminaries. The one engaged in hearing and reflecting on the great text, and now they're doing meditation, their retreat. Another did not do the hearing and reflecting, but their preliminaries then are merely a counting of mantras or prostrations and so forth. So the second person will be able to get to the required count, but the quality of their retreat will be quite different. Or to express this differently, their mental engagement when engaging in the preliminaries and the actual retreat will be of a very different quality than the first person who had as their preliminaries an extensive education of hearing and reflecting.
당연히 마음 접수도 지집이 띵이지 고미야지 고미야기 시고로와 지산 지집이 띵이지 고발라 간도 신의 주의라 유래 지집이 신의 주변도 갑라 안에 발세 딘시 진화여나 삼로 가르당 오래 진화데 매봐서 괴버주나 삼로 가르당 오래서 지산 신의 주의에 될래야 아니 신의 셈네베 탑구 탑람구 삼다제 견디조나 삼라 디당고래 디조나 디장고래서 네 셈네베 탑구세야다 근데 야 지금 가서래 가서 셈네베 탑구고네 신의 주단 직제 되네 예방아본 뒤지 예된벽원에 신의 주단 직소 진짜 디수샤상 퇴삼로지 당보 퇴 되네 삼로 디제고래 디진의 디중고래 디용 제고래 삼로지 땅제 직 약고래 러르파 직 방으로지 디지 매바이나 신의 공무에서도 제지 검지데 디수 진에 남산님부터 한 먹어네 신의 주투야 허요 말와 지난데 신의 주야라 야나 셈리베 탑국이 롭종디 당보 퇴 당보 라면서네 퇴비게 된데라 어디진데 디지오 디지용도스베 망보 삼다 디나신다 양치기 예방아본의 뒤지 예된벽원의 신의 주타 삼다베나 딜라마즈네 퇴비 된데라 어다바 디진데 디용구다 디진데 디지오구도 하선베게 방르지 삼나라야 디니기 방르 지제 하고베네 디니 곰비갑라 레직 다산딜레도 어다디 디삼당고라서 디삼당고라서 남사 mem달마손에 땅 조조를 하고 고로 앞에 마음에 들어다 디지 다른 것은 디니 땅고래 다른 것이 디 땅고래서 차상 들으시면은 막세디네 마음을 맞아도는 경라야마도 샤샤 파지 좀 돼서 그래라 디나지 당보네 야 퇴바지 신의 주비야지 곰치게 딩이 좀 곰에 삼다면에 당보 신의 주타기 탑심리베 탑구거네 삼다다다 근데 예방아 본 뒤지 예 땡배고네 삼다 디소야 파 양보 라메전에 퇴 담가 파 휴퇴 담가 휴스는 라메전 퇴 받으세요. 담가 휴퇴 되네 소소기 단다데 안에 야도두시로 되네 되네 신우다 디제 삼디 당고도 왔으면 두 진의 셈이야 방렘지 파 제지 제샤데 되네 신의 주비에 곰야 고수디 근데 교인들이 상을 리고로 와. 리도 어디 딜레송아 디디는 대삼네 디당고래. 딜레송 삼네 디당고래서 디네 람상두시네 디네 신의 주야게 디 튕긴 참고라. 디네게 다 퇴바다 이 주택에 담가 지금 마시 되네 산마다면은 디네레도 되네 가르치거나 하고 투에 갖고로 와. 세상 디네에서 뭐 계속 빼마세 계치 못하고 그러다.
Often when you talk about the term meditation, so again we're in the context of hearing, reflecting and meditating. Meditation, then we think about that it is about the cultivation of the union of calm abiding and meditative insight. So in order for such a practice to bear the fruit that one desires, to give rise to the goal of cultivating the union of calm abiding and meditative insight, one needs to have studied the topic well. One needs to know that one needs to look out for the particular obstacles of laxity and excitement. But even if one knows the words, one needs to know what they mean, what is meant by laxity, what is meant by excitement. And moreover, one needs to know what antidotes to apply when they arise. And then one needs to, for the training to be successful, there are two techniques, and at least one should know one of them, if not both, the technique of the 9 mental abidings or the technique of the 5 faults and their 8 antidotes. These need to be known well. And again, it's not just through hearing that they need to be known, but reflecting as well. In other words, it needs to be settled in one's mind, so that as one is training, as one encounters either success or obstacles, one can recognize it as such and not be thrown and doubts to arise. But one will know the topic so well through reflecting that one can continue in one's retreat without any disturbance to one's retreat because of doubts arising or uncertainty arising. Perhaps an illustration is, for example, if someone is a soldier is training, they will learn, of course, how to use their weapon, whether it's a rifle or a piece of artillery, and they will learn that at different stages of a battle, they will need to shoot at differing distances, and this is how to judge when to do so, as well as how to do so. And if they're not properly trained, it's not going to go very well for them. So likewise with a meditator, they need to understand very well what they are meditating on and all the varying steps, as well as what to look out for and how to deal with what arises. That comes from, in particular, hearing and reflecting.
다 상기 송비기 흉 차상 안서 상기 고방 토발라 냠len 지고 해야지 그 지고 해야지 내디 지고 비금센 롱다리바 안도시네 소야 직주야지 다 안에 나중에 안에 지게 지고거때 소소기 다 지게 제 마투가 가서래 지금 흉첨부디길래 따고 장고요 말은 가지고 지상 곰 냠len 제발 주변 흉첨부디에 장고요 말돼서 안에 가서래 시슈 잠래 마도 냠는 제기 담화세도 로소요래 디 담화 쉬는 냠는 제고를 선배 삼단의 디 노트를 디 삼단교 말해스 소수게 냠는 제 돈의 중심보다 돈의 약부래스 담마토베이네 대술력 균제 장교 말해서 균제 제요 말해스 지사 장구어래스 지사다 다디 내가 장마도네 가sam질 양아 저기 냠는 야야 뭐 공리도 이제 거기 중심부터 유럽 제주로 와 장주로 와 이제 장고에도 통구로 와 그래서 두시네 소수기 냠는 제통면에 대술야 두시기가 말 되네게 제바나 중심벌야 안에 낭충다 니주지고래 되네 대술야 배 최봉을 세디버 첨부사고래서 되네게 삽삽지고 된시기가 말해서 지상다 소수기 왕보단 뒤쇠단 되네게 참비기 흉침벌라 담모도 용그레스 지상 디담마도디 람미게 담가 용요질이야 담가 휴제 디토네 소소가 냠nen지에디 계침벌레스 마도 제 소수기 아니 지가 되네게 담마도베데 소수기 잠디 다고야마 판도요 말씀 신디기요 마디디기요 말에서 나 지난에도 시기요 말에서 지상 다 소수기 뒤쇠 마당와다 소수기 왕보다 참비기 토네 달래메 담가 용요를 휴제네 안도스 롭쇼제 냠nen지에 제네디고레 마도 되네게 다기요 말 판도요 말에서네 시기요 말에서 그러다.
This weekend then we looked at two great faults that we should guard our mind against, great faults that would amount to abandoning the Dharma, the grave misdeed of abandoning the Dharma, should we make either of these errors. The first we looked at was that there is a need to study and reflect on all the teachings of the Buddha, to not take the varying divisions and say some can be excluded, some aren't necessary for a practitioner like me, but rather see that all of them need to be trained in. And this was established through both quotations as well as reasons. And then we also started to look at the second greatness, and that's the greatness of the Dharma. And that is to understand that the great texts are not separate from the spiritual instructions. One here should guard one's mind from deprecating or looking down on the great text, thinking this isn't really necessary. The study of the great texts are just for those who want to be knowledgeable, or those who want to explain the Dharma, or want to be able to deal with reason to deal with objections coming from others. Such a misunderstanding we should guard our mind against. And similarly, thinking that it's the spiritual instructions or the personal or oral instructions that actually we should rely on, because that is where it's through those we find out how to train the mind. This is a mistake. Ideally, we should find our spiritual instructions through studying and reflecting on the great texts, because the great texts are the source for the spiritual instructions. But for those who see a text such as this middle Lamrim and feel, oh, this is a bit daunting, I struggle to understand it, or I don't have the time to engage with it, then for such a person, it's suitable to rely on spiritual instruction solely for now, so as to accumulate virtue and purify negativities. But even such a person, though, should hold as an aspiration to engage with the great texts.
Alright, that in the Zadang the dining body do sometimes that in the Zadang to get Sanji Che, and it is not the chick Sanji soon be che that you Dodan, Diu Ponde, Ludwig Sola Sopa Soma, that the Niki Lamanam Yusun Shepi, Chasan, Dangazugia, Sanji Tobala, Pando Yoba, and Yamlen Jena, Ne Guajiri, Sabedini Pemase, Yapore Sambana. The Negida, Danga say, Menga say, that Shung Chimbo Nala Sun Shaba Dile, Dodan, Denju, Nalama Sun Shabaji, Mado Dile, Masun Baji, Mesurduji Yomar, Stina Jiza, Menga Saleme, Menga Sida, Dodan, Guidan, Shung Chimbo Nala Sun Shaba, Yari, Sambig, Lucine, as some Daje, that Shung Chimbo Tiki, Hazuki, Lobsang Dorje, Pea, who was make Sosugi, Pea, what is make our commiata. Denigi Danganzilia, Chiki, Denigi, Shunchimbotelia, Sheshe, Denigi, and the Chik, Taguayomar Sempiki, Dopati, Sealia, Jeremy Duchin, Sanji Sung, Diki, Chazan, Yamlan Jago, but Tabachimichu, Yamlan Jago, and Diki, Chazan Lunda, Rebuke on the song, and Denigi, Chike, Shunchimbotelia, and Yamlan Jayoma, Duchin, Maris in the Chibong Tibasagri said, Jerem Janzulia, Lobnan, Bemas, a kid in Chimbuya, Anzugi, Tipusayata, and the Masai Tondala, Manzuki, Yapoya, the Sumba, and the Lobjan, Lapchikavachi, some big, some getting Chimbore, some big getting Chisu Timbetone, Manzuki, 데네게 털이야 뭐 저기 강토도 롭션 지인 셈비게다 뭐 저기 도시네 듬바기야디 다 섬다나로시 데네식 가서 디 냠네 집에 가서 섬나라 데네식 코와지 제와야디 차고로 받아 또는 인보데다 가사다 드린 슈비게다 또는 인보데네시에 뭔가 대샤샤
Just to conclude then, what to take away from our time together this weekend is to reflect on our tremendous good fortune, that all the teachings that the Buddha gave in both the sutras and tantras, as well as their commentaries by great Indian masters, it's in those that all the stages for training one's mind are to be found. So this we need to recognize, as was mentioned earlier, and not seek out special instructions thinking that is where the essence is to be found, that is where the nectar is to be found. But rather, we have met this remarkable text composed by J. Rinpoche, where all the stages for training the mind to progress towards the attainment of enlightenment are found. They're found in the correct sequence and completely. So thereby, we found a great text which summarizes the sutras and tantras and the commentaries, but doesn't summarize them in a way that means they are too abbreviated to serve as the ideal basis for us to transform our mind. Recognizing this then, we will appreciate our great good fortune, and we'll aspire to receive these teachings and reflect on them as we go, recognizing that by doing so, by hearing these teachings and thinking on their meaning, we will be accumulating vast stores of merit and purifying vast amounts of negativities. And in this way, it can be said that we are engaging in our preliminaries while through this process of hearing and reflecting.
지게 축제되고 휴실에 디나로 양안주 되게 냐다 지 냐시체라가 빼마서 고고 약고 쉬워 베선비 삼다랑이 빼 약고 중샤 선비게 다 되게 고고 약고 라샤 되네 뒤수 되네지리 한주도 시에도 빼 약고래 선비게 다 되네 소소라는 게 네수로 제 되네 그 롭선 직도나 사바신 되네 게 신수 되네 신수 되 롭전 제비게 나 제보래 선비게 도시는 가 저게 소소라랑이 될야 개와 제발에 지수 이랑 소소라랑이 야고 제발 될야 아니 지소소기 뽑아 두세 삼다베나 아니 뭐베네 무디지 지인선베게 냠는 탈신바 지투바 지인선베 삼당고야 되는 내 계신보라 자고래.
And moreover, everyone's life in your daily life, you encounter problems and difficulties, unwanted circumstances, and all too often these can overwhelm one. One can feel quite dispirited, unhappy. Here, through these teachings, remind yourselves of how truly fortunate each and every one of you are, whether we are here physically together or you're watching at home. This world is filled with people who are experiencing tremendous hardships. And no matter what circumstances people are experiencing, whether far worse than ours or even materially better than ours, they haven't met these teachings. Moreover, not only have you met these teachings, but you have the time now to have listened to them, to these sessions. And whilst you're listening, you have been thinking about the meaning, applying it to yourself. And hopefully each day between now and when we meet again in a fortnight, you'll be able to reflect on the meaning of the Dharma. Remind yourself again and again of your great good fortune. And this great good fortune didn't just happen to fall into your lap, but has come about in dependence on causes you yourself have accumulated. Therefore, in the past, you've accumulated these causes despite whatever hardships you were experiencing in your life then, and now you're experiencing their fruition. So take confidence of that you can continue to accumulate powerful causes that will lead to ever better conditions in this and future lives. And in this way, strengthen your mind through recognizing the great opportunity that you yourself have created. And thank you very much. Thank you.